Welcome. Today we're reading the chapter Blood for Treasure of the novel Tarzan, Lord of the Jungle. Last time, Lord Tarzan and Sir Bertram engaged in a fierce battle against the Knights of Nimmer and the Gobred, showcasing Tarzan's remarkable combat skills as he defeated multiple adversaries with his spear and sword. Meanwhile, Blake and Gwynalda found themselves ensnared by a group of Bedouin, who capture Blake but are stopped from killing him when Gwynalda bravely intervenes, confessing her love for him. The chapter ends with Tarzan managing to rescue Blake from his bonds, and they set off in search of Gwynalda, each pursuing a different direction based on the clues they had gathered.
For every jewel a drop of blood. All night Ibn Jad and his party marched northward. Though they were hampered by the refusal of Gwynalda to walk, yet they made rapid progress, for they were spurred on by their great desire to escape from the valley with their booty, before they should be discovered and set upon by the great host of fighting men they were now convinced were quartered in the castle and city they had been fortunate enough to find almost deserted. Avarice gave them strength and endurance far beyond that which they normally displayed, with the result that dawn found them at the foot of the ragged mountains that Ibn Jad had determined to scale rather than attempt an assault upon the castle which guarded the easy way from the valley. It was a jaded party that won eventually to the pass just above the outer Barbican that guarded the road to the city of the Sepulchre. Nor were they discovered by the warders there until the last man of them was safely on the trail leading to the low saddle at the summit of the mountains, beyond which lay the menzil of the Bedouins. The defenders of the Barbican made a sortie against them, and approached their rear so closely that the Sir Knight who commanded saw Gwynalda and recognized her, but a volley from the matchlocks of the desert people sent the crudely armed soldiers of Bohun back in retreat, though the brave knight couched his lance and charged again until his horse was brought down by a bullet, and he lay pinned beneath it. It was afternoon before Ibn Jad with his fagged company staggered into the menzil. Though they dropped in their tracks from sheer exhaustion, he allowed them but an hour of sleep before he gave the signal for the Rala, for the Sheikh of the Fendi El Guad was filled with an ever-increasing fear that the treasure and the woman would be taken away from him before he could reach the sandy wastes of his own barren Beled. The heavy weight of the treasure had been divided into several bundles, and these were distributed among his least mistrusted followers, while the custody of the girl captive was placed in the hands of Fahd, whose evil eyes filled the princess with fear and loathing. Stimbul, who had secretly scoffed at the stories of treasure and the mad tales of a beautiful woman that the Arab expected to find in some fabulous hidden city, was dumbfounded when he viewed the spoils of the Bedouin raid, and at first was inclined to attribute them to the hallucinations of his fever-racked brain. Weak, Stimbul staggered feebly along the trail, keeping as close to Fahd as he could, for he knew that of all the company this unscrupulous scoundrel would be most likely to assist him, for to Fahd a live Stimbul meant great wealth. Nor was Fahd unmindful of the fact. And now there was another purpose in the evil mind of the Bedouin, who had conceived for the white girl an infatuation that was driving him to the verge of madness. With the wealth that Stimbul had promised him, Fahd realized that he could afford to possess this lovely houri, whom otherwise a poor Bedouin must sell for the great price that she would bring. And so there revolved in the mind of Fahd many schemes whereby he might hope to gain sole possession of both Gwynalda and Stimbul. But always there loomed in the path of every plan that he considered the dour figure of his greedy sheikh. At the foot of the mountains of the Sepulchre, Ibn Jad turned toward the east, thus to avoid passing again through the country of Batando. Beyond the eastern end of the range he would turn south again and later strike west, just above the northern limits of the territory that was nominally Tarzan's. For though he knew that the Lord of the Jungle was dead, he yet feared the vengeance of his people. It was late before Ibn Jad made camp. The preparations for the evening meal were hurried. The light from the cooking fire and the paper lanterns in the bait of the sheikh was dim and flickering, yet not so dim but that Atasia saw Fahd drop something into the bowl of food that she had prepared for Ibn Jad, and which stood upon the ground between him and his would-be assassin. As the sheikh reached for the receptacle, Atasia stepped from the women's quarters and struck it from his hand, but before she could explain her act or charge Fahd with his villainy, the culprit, realizing that his perfidy had been discovered, leaped to his feet and seizing his matchlock, sprang into the women's quarters where Gwynalda had been left under the watchful care of Hirfa and Atasia. Seizing the girl by the wrist and dragging her after him, Fahd broke through the curtains at the rear of the bait and ran in the direction of his own tent. By this time the Muqa'ad of Ibn Jad was in an uproar. The sheikh was demanding an explanation from Atasia, and still unaware that Fahd had escaped through the rear of the B8, no one had followed him into the women's quarters. "He placed sim in thy food," cried Atasia. "I saw him, and the proof of it be that he fled when he knew that I had seen." "Billah," exclaimed Ibn Jad, "the son of a jackal would poison me? Seize him and fetch him to me." "He hath fled through the bait," cried Hirfa, "and taken the Nasrawiyah with him." The Bedouins sprang to their feet and took after Fahd, but at his own bait he stopped them with a bullet, and they retreated. In his tent, he seized Stimbul, who was lying upon a filthy sleeping mat, and dragged him to his feet. "Hasten," he hissed in the American's ear. "Ibn Jad has ordered that thou be slain. Quick, follow me, and I will save thee." Again Fahd had recourse to the rear curtains of a bait, and as his fellows approached the front in anger but with caution, Fahd, dragging Ginalda and followed by Stimbul, sneaked through the darkness of the Menzel and turned toward the west. It was dusk when James Blake, following the plain trail of Ibn Jad, finally clambered over the last escarpment and stood upon the trail that led through the pass toward the outer world beyond the Valley of the Sepulchre. 100 yards to his right loomed the grey towers of the Barbican. To his left was the trail that led in the direction of his heart's desire, and all about him, concealed in the bushes, were the men-at-arms of King Bohun of the Sepulchre. But this he did not guess, for how could he know that for hours the eyes of the warders had been watching his slow ascent toward the pass trail? Spent by the long climb following hours of grueling exertion without food or rest, unarmed, Blake was helpless to resist or to attempt escape, when a dozen armed men stepped from the surrounding bushes and encircled him in a band of steel. And so Sir James of Nimr was seized and hauled before King Bohun. And when he was questioned, and Bohun found that he was the same Black Knight that had thwarted his plan to abduct the Princess Ginalda, he could scarce contain himself. Assuring Blake only of the fact that he would be put to death as soon as Bohun could determine upon a fate commensurate with the heinousness of the crime, the king ordered him to be placed in chains, and the American was led away by guards to a black hole beneath the castle, where by the light of flares a smith forged a heavy iron band about one ankle, and he was chained to a damp stone wall. In the light of the flare, Blake saw two emaciated, naked creatures similarly chained, and in a far corner glimpsed a skeleton among the bones of which rusted a length of chain and a great anklet. Then silently the guards and the smith departed, taking the flares with them, and James Blake was left in darkness and despair. Upon the plain below the city of Nimr, Tarzan had overtaken the party of Bedouins led by Abd el-Aziz, and after assuring himself that the girl was not with them, he had turned without revealing himself to them, and hurried northward to take up the trail of the other party. Requiring food and rest, he lay up in the Wood of the Leopards during the heat of the day after stalking Horta the boar and making a quick kill. His belly filled, the ape-man found a high-flung tree crotch where there was little likelihood of the heavy leopards of Nimr disturbing his slumbers, and here he slept until the sun was sinking behind the western mountains. Early the following morning he reached the deserted Menzel, where Ibn Jad's people had camped during his incursion of the Valley of the Sepulchre. Some time since he had lost the spoor of Blake, but that of the girl frequently recurred, and as her rescue now took precedence over other considerations, he followed doggedly along the trail of Ibn Jad. For a time he was mystified by the fact that Ginalda's spoor, well marked by the imprints of the tiny sandals of medieval design, did not appear among the footprints of those who left the Bedouin Menzel. He lost some time searching about in an effort to discover a clue to the riddle, and presently he hit upon the truth, which lay in the fact that Ginalda's light sandals having been badly worn by her journey and far too tight for comfortable walking, she had been given a pair belonging to a Taja, and thus it became difficult to differentiate between the spoor of the two girls, who were of equal weight and of a similarity of carriage that rendered their footprints practically identical. Tarzan therefore contented himself with following the spoor of the party, and so it was that he passed their first night's camp, where Fahd had stolen Ginalda from the sheik, without discovering that 3 of its members had there turned to the west, while the main body of the Arab marched toward the east. And as Tarzan followed the spoor of Ibn Jad, 100 stalwart Waziri moved northward from the waterhole of the smooth, round rocks upon the old trail of the Bedouins. With them was Zayd, who had begged so hard to accompany them when they passed the village where he had been waiting, that at last the sub-chief had consented. When Tarzan overtook the Arab, they had already turned south around the eastern end of the mountains of the Sepulchre. He saw the bags they carried, and the evident concern with which Ibn Jad watched and guarded them. And he shrewdly guessed that the wily old thief had indeed found the treasure he had sought. But he saw no evidence of the presence of the princess, and Stimbul too was missing. Tarzan was furious. He was furious at the thieving Bedouins for daring to invade his country, and he was furious at himself because he felt that in some way he had been tricked. Tarzan had his own methods of inflicting punishment upon his enemies, and he had, as well, his own grim and grisly sense of humor. When men were doing wrong, it pleased him to take advantage of whatever might cause them the greatest suffering, and in this he was utterly ruthless with his enemies. He was confident that the Arab thought him dead, and it did not suit his whim to reveal their error to them at this time. But it did accord with his fancy to let them commence to feel the weight of his displeasure and taste the first fruits of their villainy. Moving silently through the trees, Tarzan paralleled the course of the Arab. They were often plainly visible to him, but none saw Tarzan, nor dreamed that savage eyes were watching their every move. 5 men carried the treasure, though its weight was not so great, but that one powerful man might have borne it for a short distance. Tarzan watched these men most often. These, and the Sheikh ibn Jad. The trail was wide, and the Sheikh walked beside one of those who bore the treasure. It was very quiet in the jungle. Even the Arab, garrulous among themselves, were quiet, for they were very tired, and the day was hot, and they were unused to the burdens they were forced to carry since Batando had robbed them of their slaves. Of a sudden, without warning, and with only the swish of its flight through the air to announce it, an arrow passed through the neck of the Bedouin, who walked beside Ibn Jad. With a scream, the man lunged forward upon his face, and the Arab, warned by their sheikh, cocked their muskets and prepared to receive an attack. But look where they would, they saw no sign of an enemy. They waited, listening, but there was no sound other than the droning of insects, and the occasional raucous cry of a bird. But when they moved on again, leaving their fellow dead upon the trail, a hollow voice called to them from a distance. "For every jewel a drop of blood," it wailed dismally, for its author knew well the intensely superstitious nature of the desert dwellers, and how best to affright them. It was a shaken column that continued on its way, nor was there any mention of making camp until almost sunset, so anxious were they all to leave behind this gloomy wood and the horrid Ifrit that inhabited it. But the forest persisted, and at length it became necessary to make camp. Here the campfires and food relieved the tension upon their overwrought nerves, and their spirits had revived to such an extent that there were again singing and laughter in the menzil of Ibn Jad. The old sheikh himself sat in his mukad, surrounded by the 5 bags of treasure, one of which he had opened, and beneath the light of a lantern was fondling the contents. About him were his cronies, sipping their coffee. Suddenly something fell heavily upon the ground before the bait and rolled into the mukad among them. It was the severed head of a man. Glaring up at them were the dead eyes of their fellow, whose corpse they had left lying in the trail earlier in the day. Horror-struck, spellbound, they sat staring at the gruesome thing when, from out of the dark forest, came the hollow voice again. "For every jewel a drop of blood." Ibn Jad shook as a man with ague. The men of the camp gathered close together in front of the bait of the sheikh. Each grasped a musket in one hand and searched for his hijab with the other, for each carried several of these amulets, and that in demand this night was the one written against the Jan, for certainly none but a jinn could have done this thing. Hirfa stood half within the mukad, staring at the dead face of her fellow, while Atasia crouched upon a sleeping mat in the quarters of the women. She did not see the back curtain rise, nor the figure that crept within. It was dark in the quarters of the harem, since little light filtered in from the lanterns in the mukad. Atasia felt a hand clapped across her mouth at the same instant that another grasped her by the shoulder. A voice whispered in her ear, "Make no sound, I shall not hurt thee. I am a friend to Zayd. Tell me the truth, and no harm will befall you or him. Where is the woman Ibn Jad brought from the valley?" He who held her placed his ear close to her lips and removed his hand from them. Atasia trembled like a leaf. She had never seen a jinn. She could not see the creature that leaned close to her, but she knew that it was one of those fearsome creatures of the night. "Answer," whispered the voice in her ear. "If thou wouldst save Zayd, speak and speak the truth." "Fard took the woman from our menzil last night," she gasped. "I do not know where they went." As it came, in silence the presence left the side of the terrified girl. When Hirfa sought her a moment later, she found her in a swoon.
Did you enjoy today's chapter of Tarzan, Lord of the Jungle? Why not subscribe and ring the bell?